Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to introduce our panelists for the panel discussion. Ambassador Shivshankar Menon, Distinguished Visiting Research Fellow, ISAS, NUS, and former National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister of India. Ambassador Frank Lavin, former Undersecretary of Commerce for International Trade, US, and former Ambassador of the US to Singapore. Mr. Rahul Roy-Chaudhury, Head of South Asia Program, International Institute for Strategic Studies, London, UK. Associate Professor Alan Chong, Coordinator of MSc International Relations Program, at Rajaratnam School of International Studies, NTU. Chairing the session is Professor C. Raja Mohan, Director and Visiting Research Professor, ISAS, NUS. I now hand the floor to Professor Mohan.
Thank you. Welcome back. As you can see, we have a very distinguished panel, and I'm sure that we'll have a very stimulating discussion on the issues raised by Shivshankar spoke on maritime governance and what role does South Asia have in this process. On the outset, let me just flag 5 points to begin the panel discussion. That we all agree that there's extraordinary change taking place in the oceans. But I think at least 5 things stand out, and I think I just want to highlight. First is the economic dimension. The rise of China, the slower emergence of India, and the expansion of the rest of Asian economy has actually fundamentally changed the relationship between our region and its waters. Historically, of course, the region was dependent on coastal shipping, coastal activity, to one where in the colonial period, the resources and things that the region could bring were of value to the Western world, where industrial revolutions took place. So it was as we say, a dependent relationship that emerged as part of the global situation. But today, given the rise of China, the rise of Asia more broadly, that you have the nature of Asia's dependence on its waters has dramatically changed. Countries like China, countries like India have never been as dependent on the seas for their success as they are today. Because nearly 50% of the economies of China and India are dependent on trade, and much of the trade continues to take place at sea. So therefore, the lifeline, the sea have become a more important lifeline for the economies of Asia. Therefore, what happens in the seas today is a far more important for the countries of the region than it has ever been before. So that's the economic dimension. The economic dependence on the seas is the first thing that it can be. Second is, I think, along with economics, there's change of politics that has taken place. That what we're seeing today is not just the rise of Asia, but the extraordinary power shift that is taking place. China today is the second largest economy, soon to be the number 1 in aggregate terms. It's also the second largest defense spender, and its impact on the world and its institutions, its structures, we're just beginning to feel it, and the consequences of it. So, what does the power shift do to the way we organize the rules, institution, norms that Ambassador talked about? Therefore, the political change brings in a whole set of imperatives, and I think people are still struggling to come to terms with the fact that that the rise of Asia, what does it mean for the power relationships in the Indian Ocean and beyond. Third is geography, that the nature of our mental maps has to change because of the economic and political change. That we've traditionally talked about the Indian Ocean, we've seen Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean are from different places. But today, we saw in the last few days in the Shangri-La dialogue, the interrelationship between the two oceans is beginning to come into play. I mean, it's not entirely new. I mean, really, it's because of the developments of the last 6 decades, we saw these as separate places. But we go back to Singapore and its founding, there's a bridge between China and India, sitting at the cusp of the Indo-Pacific, shall we say. Or Indonesia, which sits across, astride the sea lines of communication between the Pacific Ocean and the Indian Ocean. These are not new things. What has changed is China and India, from being inward-oriented economies, have become outward-oriented economies. Therefore, the Chinese interest in the Indian Ocean is going to grow. India's interest in the Pacific Ocean is going to be growing a little more slowly. But the fact is that how we think about the region must change because of the structural change that is taking place in the politics and economics. Fourth is the geography is not just about a relationship between different parts of the world. It's also about the changing nature of our environment. The assumption until now that you could do your economic activity, everything can be dumped in the sea, and the sea is a perpetual sink to the kind of refuse that we produce, and that doesn't make a difference to the world. All of you are familiar with the arguments about anthropogenic change that is taking place and the environment. Today, where there's a health of the oceans that Ambassador Chong referred to. Recently at the Commonwealth Summit, health of the oceans has become number one priority. So whichever way you look at it, whether it is the rising sea levels, whether it is the environmental issues, that the larger questions of human security, larger questions of environment, that the growth of Asia and the impact of it on the broader question of a planetary environment, especially in the oceans, is a concern. And lastly, I think it's important, because we talk about governance, governance is about law and the institutions. Now the institutions that we're so familiar with, the US alliances, IORA that was referred to, IONS, Indian Ocean Naval Symposium, some of these are new, the ASEAN, APEC, over the decades, we don't still match the Europeans in the alphabet soup, but we have a large number of institutions. But would these institutions survive in the same form if there is a fundamental shift in the form, if there is a shift in the nature of economics? So can these institutions be adapted, modified, reformed in some form, or do we create fundamentally new institutions? So that question, I think, we're beginning to face it, whether it's a question of American alliances. We see a whole lot of alignment, realignment beginning to take place in the region. Therefore, the whole question of what happens to institutions is ASEAN centrality. We heard a lot about it, the Shangri-La dialogue. Can it cope with the extraordinary power shift that is taking place around it? Because again, and finally, institutions at the end about law and norms that we talk about. The law, we're not talking about Moses Code. We're not talking about a divine rule. Sometimes when we talk about rules-based order, it gives a sense of somehow there's a divine mandate to the rules-based order. But when there are rising powers and they contest the existing power of the regime, rules are written. That's been the history of the past. Now the big question is, if the rules are going to be rewritten, can they be written in collaboration, in consultation, or are they going to be done unilaterally? That is the question. It's not just about there's an abstract, predefined set of rules. It's a question of interpretation of the law of the sea. What does the law of the sea allow you to do in the territorial or EEZ of other countries? These are the points of disputation today. Those, I think, in the end, there is going to be no higher justice because we're international. And that even winning a court case does not automatically get you justice, as we saw in the case of China and Philippines. The point is about politics. Law must respond to changes, will respond to changes in politics and economics, and how those are rearranged is a story of politics. And I think, let me conclude here by just drawing one episode of what happened in this part of the world in around 1601. The origin of the modern law of the sea was not often here. When a Dutch ship raided Santa Catarina of Portugal, looted the stuff, and was distributing it to the Dutch East India Company shareholders. At least some in Netherlands, it's Northern Europe, so the question of morality. The Mennonites, who were a large number of them, were participants, said, look, no, this is immoral. Can property acquired by you, is it legitimate? And now you're distributing it as part of the regular company action. So therefore, what Dutch East India Company did, like we hire consultants these days, and Dutch East India Company hired a man called Grotius to write a pamphlet on justifying that it is not an illegal act, that the Pope's decision of dividing the East and West by a stroke of pen between Portugal and Spain cannot be the last word. Seas are a natural highway for everyone, and that the whole question of the mare liberum, or the freedom of the high seas, was enunciated in the context of a specific event that took place in this part of the world. Today, as we can see, the law of the sea is being challenged again in this part of the world. Therefore, I think how we imagine law, how the laws are going to be change, who's going to organize them. They're all big issues for discussion. I think we have two gentlemen here, I think, who can speak about this with great authority. So I'm going to start with Ambassador Shivshankar Menon.
Thank you, Raja. You know, I told Ambassador Ong earlier that I would decide what to say after I heard it. Now, after listening to him, and now Raja, there's nothing left, frankly, for me to say. But I think what you said is absolutely right about 5 main things that we should be looking at when we look at maritime governance in the Indian Ocean. Because, and let me start with the geography that you mentioned. You know, the old naval instructors used to tell us that the seas are one, and it's true. If you look at the globe, assume that you're looking at Antarctica in the middle, all the oceans are connected. And that's precisely their utility, that you can actually, it's the cheapest form of transport, that they connect all the land masses of the earth, and that you can actually move goods, people, ideas, whatever, across them. Which is why terms like the Indo-Pacific and so on are useful, because they enable you to think of this as one interconnected space. But the fact is that and it also makes it very hard to categorize. Therefore, when you speak only of the Indian Ocean or to deal with security only in the Indian Ocean is not sufficient. You need to look at also security across this entire maritime space. And that's what we heard last week in the Shangri-La dialogue. But at the same time, the geography does differ. The Indian Ocean, the Atlantic, the Pacific, but the Indian Ocean more than the others are open oceans. At no stage in history has any one power controlled all 10 choke points around the Indian Ocean. Not even the Royal Navy at the height of Pax Britannica quite managed that feat. And this is why over history the Indian Ocean has always been an ocean of trade primarily, whereas the Atlantic and the Pacific have been both a major domain of warfare and oceans of trade. And transatlantic trade was overtaken by what goes through the Pacific only in the 80s, and at the rate we're going now, the Indian Ocean is going to overtake both of them, because you have something like 70% of the world's container traffic and traded oil going through this ocean. Whereas the closed seas, the near seas, like the South China Sea or the Mediterranean and so on, are really enclosed geographically, can be blockaded, can be controlled, and can be looked at quite differently. And therefore, if you look at where maritime naval warfare has actually taken place over history, much more of it has been actually in the enclosed ocean, in the enclosed seas, in the closed seas geographically. So my point is simple. Our security, our fate, our trade, economies depend on the entire body of water. But when you start looking for specific security solutions, you have to take the individual characteristics of those oceans into account. There's no one size fits all. You can't do the same thing for security in the Indian Ocean as you would do in the South China Sea or in the Western Pacific, each of which has a very different situation. And it's therefore very important that when we look at governance, and governance in the broad sense in which Jivanta used it, that we look at both the different geographies and the linkages across it. Why do I bring this up? Because it's difficult to talk of maritime governance limited only to South Asia and the Indian Ocean. We need to look at the broader picture, at the interconnected nature of the oceans. And in a sense, this brings me to a larger point. If you look at maritime orders, they are positive sum. Unlike continental orders, land belongs to one power or another. You draw a boundary, sovereignty applies. That's not true of the ocean. And that's why we started with the principle of Mare Liberum, of why the oceans are actually the global commons. Because when you trade across the ocean, everybody benefits from it. But whereas continental orders are much more, are actually zero-sum, in a sense, compared to maritime orders, which is what we are looking for. We're looking for a positive sum maritime order across the entire geographical space. That now, and why is this important for the Indian Ocean especially? It's important because, nearly 40 nations border this ocean. 90% of the world's Islamic population actually lives around this ocean. 1/3 of the total world population is around this. And if you look at the locus of economic activity, whichever way you look at it, just look at undersea cables, which carry all our internet traffic. Look at the proportion that goes through the Indian Ocean, that goes through now what we call the Indo-Pacific, if you want. It's incredible if you look at the amount of traffic that's now. We don't often think of these as sea lanes of communication, but they are undersea lanes of communication, which actually affect our futures. And because of the open geography of the Indian Ocean, it's also an area where multiple navies, multiple powers, multiple ideologies, interests will compete. And with the demise of the unipolar world after the 2008 World Economic Crisis, this has become even clearer. You look right through the Indo-Pacific, or just at the Indian Ocean. China's entered the Indian Ocean for the first time in history since that very brief, unsustained, and possibly unsuccessful attempt during the Ming. And we've seen how the importance of this entire region has grown in the recent past in terms of energy flows, in terms of trade, in terms of its proximity to hotspots, to flashpoints, and also in terms of its importance to the world economy. In terms of ship days spent, in terms of presence of naval forces, you can see clearly that the balance of power is shifting. And what's actually happening, to my mind, is that we are watching the world's greatest arms race across this belt, and most of it is naval. And most of it is offensive, a large part of it is undersea rather than on sea. If you look at the nature of armaments, now you can debate, there will be endless debate about the value of aircraft carriers and whether they're targets or whatever. But the fact is that there is an arms race, an arms build-up going on across the region, and it's been going on now for almost 20 years. Because people know that their prosperity and so on depends on this ocean, and they also sense that great power competition is putting it at risk. We never admit it. No government stands up and says the situation is actually risky or unstable. But if you watch their behavior, that's the way they're behaving. They're acting as though they believe it. And that's one reason why I think you're seeing what you're seeing. You're also seeing a shift in doctrines and in military postures across the region, all of which actually, to my mind, have led us into a completely new situation, which is actually historically unprecedented. We haven't had a situation like this before in the past. The good news, to my mind, being an Indian, is that unlike the South China Sea, East China Sea, maritime security issues in the Indian Ocean, to my mind, are not presently critical. And the likelihood of nation-on-nation high-level combat is low, basically. That doesn't mean we don't have issues. We have a whole range of other issues. Piracy, we've shown an ability to deal with, both off the Somali coast and Malacca. And we've done it successfully in cooperation with each other, led by Singapore here. But the new issues that we face, we have shown no ability to deal with, whether it's overfishing, whether it's environmental degradation and what we're doing to the oceans, what we've done actually to the Indian Ocean, and whether it's also, we have done some work, some success in dealing with humanitarian and other disasters, and we've put in place some systems. But what is really missing, despite all the alphabet soup of organizations that we have, is crisis management and confidence building measures, which to my mind should be done now. So what should we be doing as we go forward? Can we develop norms, institutions, and so on? You know, unfortunately, I wish I were an optimist and I did believe in all these things. But I don't see a single boundary on Earth which is where it was 200 years ago. Not even the US-Canada one. These are things, norms, institutions, boundaries, they reflect the balance of power. And today we're in a situation across this entire region where that balance of power is shifting rapidly, and we know it's changing. We've seen it change. Think of the last 20 years, last 40 years, where we were, where we are today. Now, if it's changing at this rate, and what's more, so many of us think it's going to be better for us in the future. China thinks so, India thinks so, many of us think this future is going to be better. Why would we fix the status quo? Why would the powers concerned say, okay, stability is our goal? We'll say stability is our goal, but none of us act to maintain it, because we want to improve the situation from our point of view. And that's where the danger comes. So then how do we actually avoid catastrophe? For me, the simplest way is build from the bottom up. This is the Asian way after all. Start dealing with the things that you can. The world's largest mercantile trading nations are here. So we have an interest in freedom of navigation, in keeping these sea lanes secure and open. We don't have a common interest in who they belong to. The moment you start treating it as my property or yours, we'll have arguments forever. And there's no world court that's going to solve these problems. So deal with freedom of navigation first, separate it from the ownership problem, from the territoriality that we ascribe to these oceans, whether they're closed or open seas. Find things like this. Counter-piracy is a good example of how we put together a coalition of the willing, and we did what we had to. Do what we need to for fishing, for overfishing. We can do, these are the kinds of, we can put in place the building blocks of a maritime order. But if we look for one large, wonderful solution, a grand organization, a set of principles that everybody signs on to, I'm afraid we're heading for disappointment. And I don't think that's very practical. I'd better stop here. I was told 15 minutes, and I've gone on. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor. Let me begin by thanking you for sharing this in your opening remarks. Thank you, Jananta, for the entire book project. It's quite a journey to undertake this, but you saw through to the end. I think we have a lovely book out of this. And also want to thank again the High Commissioner and the Ambassador for joining us today. Look, it's a timely book, I'd say, for two reasons. I want to talk about India, where my chapter is, but to put it in context, there's two things going on. One is South Asia's on the move. South Asia's on the move economically and politically, and it's doing so, I think, in a more purposeful fashion, a more extended period of time than I think we've seen in the modern era. That's point one. But point two is this takes place at a moment where, to my regret, the two powers that historically been the most internationalist, my country and Great Britain, have decided to tilt against internationalism. And so the importance of South Asia playing this kind of international role is heightened ever since. As a result, I think we have from that region a more consequential policy development than we've ever seen. This means more scrutiny. This means more criticism, which no one likes. But also, though, we hope means more thoughtful commentary, which takes us back to the book, and more opportunity for economic collaboration, which takes you into my modest contribution to the book. I want to offer a few comments on my theme, which was India's maritime role, and just touch on 3 points. I was reminded in sort of making notes for today, it's hard to summarize what's going on and sort of what it means in a few minutes, but I was reminded of an interview some years ago that Mikhail Gorbachev gave when he was still General Secretary of the Soviet Union, that he gave an interview to the BBC. And this is at a time late in his tenure when the Soviet Union was going through a rather wrenching sort of economic transformation. And it was clearly sort of economically painful, a challenging time to them. And the BBC presenter asked Gorbachev if he could sum up the Soviet economy in one word. And Gorbachev said, good. It's good. And the presenter said, well, could you sum it up in 2 words? He said, oh, not good. So, I don't want to be categorical with regard to India because it's much more complicated. But the first point I think people should take on board is India's economy is outperforming. It's really a good news story. This does not, for the sake of the High Commissioner's emotional equilibrium, this does not mean to suggest the other parts are not good. So I'm not trying to draw it in, but the economy is performing very well. And we look at all the macroeconomic indicators of GDP growth, per capita income, investment, you just see a lot of good news. Now, it's coming from a modest base, it's a developing nation, but still, it's good news and it sustained itself for an extended period of time. Right? So that is the good, it's outperforming, you should say. But then that takes me to the second point, which is regarding trade. I have to say India is underperforming, that it lags where it should be given the size of its economy. In fact, I can tell you one vignette from when I came in as U.S. Undersecretary of Trade, because we got monthly trade data of leading trade partners. And you, of course, review these and perform your diagnostics into that, look at those for policy complaints, issues, opportunities. So it sort of drives a lot of the policy process, is this monthly data. And it's the top 25 trading partners. Well, India's not on the list. India's not a top 25 trading partner. So I had to take the list down to 30. Now the monthly product out of the concert is the top 30 trade partners. You go online, you'll see it. And India, by the way, in this meantime, over the past 10 years, is now something like number 17. So India's been moving up the rankings, if you will. But it's underweight. Let's say it that way. It's underweight where it should be on trade. And look, there's a complicated tariff regime where there's a lot of anomalies in the tariff regime, and then there's a complicated administrative apparatus that adds cost and time and delay. So all of these together, I think, push India toward underperformance regarding trade. So my third point, where I try to leave comments in the book, and I'll just touch on one or two here, is look, these problems can be tackled. There's solutions. Now, there's political constraints, there's rent seeking, there's bureaucratic inertia, there's all sorts of reasons why inefficiencies creep into every nation's trade regime. So easy for somebody on a stage to say, let's fix it, harder to fix it still. But let me just offer a few ideas that might help frame the discussion constructively. One, regarding the administrative side of this, just the forms that have to be filled out, and the approval process and the multiple layers of activity that need to be undertaken. What is striking to me is that India is a global superpower when it comes to IT, but it has not yet applied this IT capability to the trade regime. Because all of this ought to move into electronic systems, and all of this ought to move to frictionless systems. And there's an extraordinary ecosystem of IT capabilities in India that can sort of solve every problem in the world except seemingly its own. So I guess this is like the old parable of the cobbler's children go shoeless, right? The opportunity costs are there. You say if you've got a global contract to help somebody do something, you're not going to spend a lot of time trying to tell the fellow running one of the ports that he's doing it wrong. You're going to say, to hell with him, I'm going to really try to make a difference in the world. But I just make that note, that there's an enormous IT capability. It's not applied against this problem. The second point I note is, look, given the fact that there are almost without a doubt political constituencies that are protectionist, there is rent seeking, there's inertia, there's normal sort of economic nationalism, there's all of these factors that impede progress on trade. this tells me the policymakers need to think about where there might be some niche opportunities move ahead that don't deal with this set of problems. And let me give you two examples. One, India, like many countries, applies tariffs on products which it doesn't make. So to say, there's no domestic constituency that is going to be dislocated if these tariffs are removed. Now, it's a small segment of India's imports, but nonetheless, there's a strong argument there saying, boy, India should be able to move more rapidly on that set, on that family of products, because there's no competition. Secondly, India applies tariffs on products that we would say have extraordinarily high social benefit. So, for example, medical devices, medical technology, pharmaceuticals, pollution control equipment, and so forth, where you say there's significant social benefit. So don't even look at these items as trade factors. Look at these as human well-being factors, and can move with tariffs on those. So the point is, there are niche areas where India should have the capability to move that at least symbolically help the national economy go the right way. That concludes my remarks, and thank you for letting me speak.
Observations on India's trade policy. Thank you, Raj. I'd like to focus my remarks on India. When India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi spoke at the IISS Shangri-La Dialogue 3 days ago, it was very clear that the Indo-Pacific region lay at the heart of India's foreign and security policy. At the same time, the Prime Minister emphasized that the Indian Ocean holds the key to India's future. What I'd like to do in the next few minutes actually is to examine the relationship between India's stated policy towards the Indian Ocean and Prime Minister Modi's remarks on the Indo-Pacific at the Shangri-La Dialogue. But before I do this, one thing is fairly clear, and that is that that the Modi government's perspective towards maritime security is significantly different from the past. And I say this for a simple reason. For over a decade and a half, India has said that the Indian Ocean was part of India's immediate and extended neighborhood, over which it had a legitimate interest. But I believe this remained largely rhetorical, with the Indian Ocean playing only a relatively minor role in India's foreign and security policy. It is only now that this rhetoric is turning into reality, with maritime security becoming a foreign and security policy priority for the Modi government. And this is, I believe, due to three reasons. The first is India's higher economic growth, fueled by greater energy consumption, making India deeply dependent on the Indian Ocean for both trade and energy, countering maritime terrorism, and concerns, finally, over China's expansion of presence and influence in the Indian Ocean. Let me come to the last part of this of China a bit later. But what I'd like to do is break this up into first the Indian Ocean and the Indo-Pacific. And to start off with the Indian Ocean, it's very clear that when Prime Minister Modi visited three island states of the Indian Ocean in March 2015, he also unveiled a vision for the future of India's policy towards the Indian Ocean, which he named Sagar, security and growth for all in the region. This essentially encompassed a five-pronged approach, which included deepening economic and security cooperation, strengthening maritime security capacities, advancing peace and security, responding to emergencies, and calling for respect for international maritime rules and norms by all countries. In an article in the latest issue of the IISS journal Survival on the Indian Ocean that has just been published, Dr. Kate Sullivan of Oxford University and I have argued that India is responding to China's naval presence in the Indian Ocean in a particular manner. But the manner that the response is being carried out comes with its own challenge. And this is the China factor for India in the Indian Ocean. The manner of its response is selective, but this focuses partly on seeking to compete in certain infrastructure projects in the region to enhance regional connectivity, to ensure that India will become among the first, if not the first, contributor to humanitarian and disaster relief operations in its neighborhood, to expand bilateral maritime security and defense cooperation with island states to that of a net security provider thrust, to facilitate a diplomatic and political push into the southwestern and eastern areas of the Indian Ocean, along with an attempt to significantly upgrade India's strategic partnerships with the US, Japan, and Australia. Having said that, we've seen that in the last few months, India has faced difficulties in implementing these objectives, particularly in terms of the Maldives, the crisis that has taken place in the Maldives, and the inability of India to influence developments there. Similarly, in the case of Sri Lanka as well, there is in India great concern over the developments that have taken place over Hambantota port in Sri Lanka. So for the Indian Ocean, I think it's fairly clear that India's policy, focus on Sagar, the policy in a five-pronged effort to counter China in different ways is very much stated and clear, though it has problems. Let's come to the Indo-Pacific. Importantly, in terms of the Indo-Pacific, at the IISS Shangri-La dialogue, Prime Minister Modi defined the Indo-Pacific region as stretching from the shores of Africa to that of the Americas, thereby incorporating the Gulf region, which is very important to India, as well as the Indian Ocean island states, again equally important for various other reasons, that had previously been left out of definition of the Indo-Pacific by other countries. He also said that this Indo-Pacific region, in his view, was to be a free, open, inclusive region in pursuit of progress and prosperity. The use of the term Indo-Pacific was not to be directed against any country, nor was it to be seen as a grouping that sought to dominate in any sense. In this context, it was notable that Prime Minister Modi deliberately did not use the word Quad that has been in fashion in the last few years, the grouping of the US, India, Japan, and Australia. For India, the core of its Indo-Pacific vision will be ASEAN and will be India's Act East policy. The Prime Minister also said that India's Sagar policy, which was applicable till 3 days ago to the Indian Ocean, is also applicable to the East, and that brings very interesting issues. But in terms of the Indo-Pacific specifically, India's relationship with the US is critical. And the Prime Minister stressed that India and the US shared a vision of an open, stable, secure, and prosperous Indo-Pacific region. Prime Minister Modi also sent a public message seeking continued engagement with China, but at the same time, there was a thinly veiled criticism of China when he highlighted the importance of partnerships based on the basis of shared values and interests. He also used the term rules-based international order for the region, which he stressed must equally apply to all, individually as well as to the global common. And there was criticism also of infrastructure projects that were not based on respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity, consultation, good governance, transparency, viability, and sustainability. So to conclude, what I believe is taking place is that India today definitely has an Indo-Pacific vision. But the core of this vision definitely lies within the Indian Ocean. Bound by the strategic primacy of the Indian Ocean for India, and by the constraints that India has on its projection of sea power, in the short term, India's engagement with the Indo-Pacific framework will remain, I believe, largely diplomatic, economic, and rhetorical. India's core strategic focus continues to lie west of the Strait of Malacca. In terms of declaratory policy and defense diplomacy, India is certainly looking towards the Indo-Pacific, but due to its limited naval expansion program and related capability and capacity deficiencies, it is highly unlikely that this will stretch operationally to areas east of the Straits of Malacca and Singapore. The Indian Navy, I believe, has clear incentives for a strong operational role within the Indian Ocean, and little such incentive for a role that extends to the South China Sea or the broader Pacific Ocean. So, in essence as well, we've seen that India's track record in multilateral cooperation within the region remains poor, and it is unclear whether existing forums, such as the Indian Ocean Rim Association, whose performance is weak, or the Indian Ocean Naval Symposium, whose achievements are more impressive but not impressive enough yet, will be sufficient to form any sort of governance order within the Indian Ocean. To conclude, essentially, I believe that in military terms, it is imperative that India effectively builds up its capabilities at sea for the Indian Ocean. This is an area where it still has tremendous advantages over the Chinese Navy. Even the Chinese naval expansion in the next few years may well be narrowing this gap. Thank you.
I happen to have some slides, knowing that I'll be the last speaker of the day. So just to give you something to focus on literally. Thank you to Devanta and Mohan for having me on this panel. Now, I start by congratulating the editor on a very remarkable book, and I think this will be a very valuable resource for all the serious researchers on South Asian region, not just India. Now, having said that, I think my remit has been to issue a few provocations, potentially resulting in a sequel to this volume. And I think there are plenty of eligible editors in this audience who can take up this matter at some point. Now, if you look at the Indian Ocean, and then imagine it in relation to the land all around it, and of course, what's not shown in the slide there is Antarctica. All right, you realize that it's actually a very complicated pan-region. In the sense that there are little regions within it that seem to be connected by the ocean. Now, I start off by talking about economic security architecture. Could someone change the slide? Yeah, the economic security architecture is actually the favorite part of the book for me. Now, it ranges all over. There's no one particular chapter that deals squarely with it. It's all over the place. Which is actually good, which means that we have actually a very complex hierarchy of agendas for security, if you want to think about it that way. Now, I won't go through exactly according to what I've listed on the slide, but I cluster it under the economic, the security, and what I call non-traditional security issues. The blue economy, I think, has been accounted for by Ambassador Ong's keynote speech, so I won't go into that. Certainly, if you rethink the idea of the Indian Ocean beyond a traditional naval geopolitics, there's a tremendous amount of economic wealth that can be generated from offshore activities, in-ocean activities, undersea activities, and so on. And this is where I think we should not only look at the Indian economy, we should also think about the economies of Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and the rest of the African coast along the Indian Ocean. Fishing is a major industry. One way of enriching a lot of these global south states is to encourage them to explore possibilities of creating offshore industries and so on. And of course, fishing should not be the only focus. How about offshore resorts and so on? One mustn't forget there's Madagascar and there's also Mauritius, part of the Indian Ocean. What about Maldives? All right. So there are all these possibilities. In addition, I think India should act as a natural leader in trying to pioneer some kind of free trade agreement. I know, bearing in mind Ambassador Lavin's comments, that India is somewhat underperforming here. But why not? This is about international leadership for the 21st century. Free trade agreements, especially in this troubled time, the international order, is most welcome. India could at some point also try to compete with China by offering emergency lending measures, if it's possible at all, to some of its neighbors. And why not? The softer range of aid possibilities is wide open. The sharing of good practices across a wide range of economic realms is something which I think great power can reasonably put together. Now let me think aloud about security in general. Now, I've already mentioned a few small states around the Indian Ocean Rim. I think in a sequel to this volume, we need to think about the security perceptions of the weaker states. I know from the perspective of a great power, one might not think that the smaller states have any kind of tangible security doctrines, but they do actually. All right. So the idea of repeating this mantra of an open and inclusive Indian Ocean regime, whether you call it IORA or the Free and Open Indo-Pacific, has to take into account the concerns of Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and of course the Africans, Tanzania, Somalia, if you do recognize some degree of sovereign government in Somalia. And of course, one must not forget South Africa. And of course, there's Iran as well. Iran definitely will have at some point interest in the Indian Ocean. What about things that are often forgotten as a matter of historical inconvenience, like the idea of zones for peace? If you look across to the southeastern part of the Indian Ocean, where the ASEAN region basically seems to have gotten its act together, the idea of zoning for peace does appeal to some of the weaker states. And perhaps this idea should be explored. Recently, RSIS had a visitor, Professor T.V. Paul. I had a long discussion with him. And I think he's going to surface the idea of reintroducing the idea of zoning for peace as part of a new wave of security multilateralism in the Indian Ocean. And those of us who have been observing international relations using the Indian Ocean region as a case study would realize that this is actually a rich area for applying Barry Buzan's concept of regional security complexes. I did a shorthand count in my rehearsal for today's remarks. There are easily 5 of them. The Persian Gulf region, the East African coast, and again, I don't know if South Africa sees itself as a primarily Indian Ocean power. So that's one, roughly the second one. The third one would be Antarctica itself. One must not forget, all aspiring maritime powers will want to look to Antarctica for energy resources and potentially as a base for other kinds of commercial projection. It's an underexplored frontier, definitely. And then you look across all the way towards the ASEAN region. There's ASEAN itself. That is also a regional security complex. And then the Bay of Bengal could also be one. But of course, if you look at the Indian Ocean from the perspective of New Delhi, the Bay of Bengal is part of the northern Indian Ocean, and so on. Again, so this is part of an emerging security architecture we need to think about. And of course, I'd like to plumb for this the idea of non-traditional security issues as a way forward towards forging a very tangible, free and open Indo-Pacific. Now, I noticed that the authors made very cursory references to this cataclysmic natural disaster that happened on Boxing Day 2004, the Indian Ocean tsunami. Why is there so little mention? These things are not just random occurrences. They occur regularly, and I bet you that if in the sequel to this volume, you invite someone from Bangladesh to write about their security concerns, natural disasters will be part of it. So that is, I think, a very useful opportunity for fostering low political collaboration. How do you mitigate natural disasters around the Indian Ocean rim? And of course, piracy, as his Ambassador Menon mentioned, is definitely another one. In fact, one should say that piracy is a shining example of how low political cooperation can actually benefit peace all along the Indian Ocean rim. I recall reading that Task Force 151, as the Gulf of Aden Anti-Piracy Patrol subsequently became known, was, I think, a high watermark of naval cooperation amongst rival great powers. The US Navy was there, the Royal Navy was there, the Chinese Navy was there, Indian Navy was there, the Republic of Singapore Navy was there. All right, and I believe the Malaysian Navy also sent a contingent. So this is an example of how nations can work together in a multilateral naval setting to deal with unconventional security issues. And of course, fisheries. One of the chapters referred to the nexus between science, policy networks, and so on. I think fisheries are a wonderful example for forging cooperation between India and all of the littoral states, because fishing is, I think, a major source of food supply for all, virtually every one of the Indian Ocean Rim states. So that's, I think, potential profitable cooperation coming on stream. And finally, what about more practical things that involve us in connectivity? Okay, I'm glad Ambassador mentioned the undersea cables as a kind of modern day version of sea links of communication. Now, I also want to pose a parallel example. What about air traffic control? Okay, here I have to bring in the very tragic MH370 incident. Now, I would think that if Australia says that I've run out of money or I don't have the political capability of carrying on with the search, could India consider taking up the mantle? Again, it doesn't have to have a fixed deadline, but certainly, in the name of oceanographic exploration, certain humanitarian efforts can be undertaken, surely. All right. Now, the next slide, please. Sino-Indian relations. Here, I think my esteemed fellow panelists have said everything that needs to be said. I just want to reinforce this point that CBMs, confidence building measures, are an idea whose time has definitely come. Okay? We have 3 nuclear powers in the Indian Ocean region, and potentially, if you count Iran, 4th. We need confidence building measures now. All right. So on a practical level, I think just to stabilize the deterrent scenario, we need to exchange officials, data, etc. You must recall that the US-Soviet rivalry during the Cold War started out on a very sour and very cold footing. Yet, ultimately, they managed to create some kind of modus vivendi between themselves. All right, so I think I look forward to this at some point in the Indian Ocean region. Development. Now, this would of course escalate into what I will say about the Belt and Road Initiative in a short while. Development should be a low political issue that should be easy for diplomatic collaboration across any number of countries in the Indian Ocean region. And I also note with satisfaction that the Indo-Pacific vision is actually a reality, given the intense interaction between India and Japan in recent years. I'm happy to note that collaborating on a wide range of connectivity issues, including high-speed railways and so on. The India-ASEAN Commemorative Summit, I hope, also will initiate a number of initiatives that can take off in terms of economic collaboration. The reference within the free and open Indo-Pacific vision, open access and rules of the road, fair rules for commerce, for trade, and so on, is mostly to be welcomed. And I think ASEAN would prove to be a very able partner for all of Indian Ocean Rim Association states at some point. And finally, Shivshankar asked me to ponder the big questions in the last slide. Could you have the last slide? Yeah. Okay, I hope that without trying to overstate the utility of the ASEAN model of regionalism, that some degree of neoliberal institutionalism can be pursued in the coming years in the Indian Ocean region. Now, this requires at some point great powers to accept that the interests are best served. Again, one can game it in so many ways using game theory. In a collaborative arrangement in a multilateral setting. What you cannot do unilaterally for reasons of political risk, for reasons of military weaknesses and so on and so forth, you can do through multilateral efforts, and I think this is something to be celebrated. I also note that if one forces a comparison or a contrast between the Belt and Road Initiative and the Free and Open Indo-Pacific Vision, I would argue that they're actually playing at 2 different core ideas. To me, the Free and Open Indo-Pacific sounds like it is heavily security-centric in a military strategic sense. Whereas if you look at the BRI, here I think one has to be a little bit more circumspect about China's position. Now, it might be seen as a way of China to dominate a great number of countries all along the Maritime and landed Silk Road, but it can also be seen as a way of saying, all right, beyond sovereign governments and to the publics, and those of us who are looking at the BRI from the perspective of small and medium-sized enterprises, multinational companies, and so on. This is a way of making sure that China is engaged with the world's economy. If they build a road, if they build railroads, if they build ports, can it not be used by third and fourth and fifth parties? And then thereafter, the next stage would be to create an export processing zone, a free trade zone, etc. around these facilities. And it opens up the interiors of previously underdeveloped parts of the world. Not too long ago, an Iranian high-level delegation visited RSIS and had the opportunity of sitting in. I was pleasantly surprised that the Iranian officials were speaking like investment promotion officials. And I think this is the way things are going forward. Of course, none of them said anything critical about China. But nonetheless, the idea was that if a great power is willing to build these infrastructural improvements, okay, we welcome it. Because it is a way of catalyzing something better for each of our countries. And I think at some point, India should also join the BRI at some point. And again, it doesn't have to be a win-lose situation, it can be win-win at some point. And I believe that ultimately ASEAN welcomes both the free and open Indo-Pacific as well as the Belt and Roads Initiative because we stand to gain. Why would the weaker states have to decide on a win-lose alignment? This is the 21st century, it's not Cold War, and so on. So this point about geographical warfare between the two visions is, I think, a largely semantic one. Most states will welcome both because this is about win-win for the future. Thank you.
It's rarely that you are on a panel where all the speakers stick to time and we really 15 minutes, finish for 10 minutes ahead of time. So we have a reasonable amount of time for question and answers. But before we start the discussion, maybe I just ask one question to each of the panelists, then we'll take it from there. I think to Mr. Menon, you were involved in much of India's new initiatives that we created in the last decade or more. Whether it was the setting up of the Indian Ocean Naval Symposium in 2008 when the Foreign Secretary, 2011 onwards when we started developing the IRA financial security advice. You also did the trilateral India Maldives security. And you were involved in this extensive negotiations with America and so on, range of issues. After the nuclear deal, much of the talk about India being part of the balancing game, I mean, long before the Pacific was invented. But even for the matter, even the Pacific was used by Prime Minister Mohan as well as different lines. So there is some level of. But my question to you is, when you talk about governance and order and law, how successful have been India's experience with this institution? Because we found out it's quite hard to, one thing to celebrate, another propping shop, but it's not easy to deliver on the substance. And that we found different levels of difficulty. So how do you rate that experience? And is that the direction India should go, and India should focus more on the balance of power? The second part of it was specifically in terms of how you, the question that Rahul asked, I mean, I'm not trying to set you up for a crossfire, but the idea that if we don't control Maldives or policies of trade, is that rooted to the crisis there? Does any great power fully control politically surrounding space? So that's the question.
Yeah, I think to both your questions about how easy was it to deal with these new institutions and to try. One reason why I think the way to go is to put in place the building blocks, find the common interest, is because when you try one overarching institution, then everybody's individual interest gets diluted. Not everybody is interested in everything. And great powers might have a big range of interests, and they might be interested not just in freedom of navigation, but in the environment, in fisheries and so on. But most countries actually have a limited range of interests. And if you make a Venn diagram of where everybody's interests overlap, the larger the number, the more the variation in size and interest, the harder it is to find that common area which suits everybody. Which is why my preference is for, based on that experience, my preference is for actually building it up bit by bit. and letting those who are interested in each area, where all the areas that Professor just mentioned, Professor Chong mentioned, I think that's, if we did that bit by bit, then I think it's much easier to actually proceed. The other issue that you raised, about, you were saying, the control, yeah. In today's day and age, firstly, you can't control the choices of other sovereign states. I mean, there are limits of power that I think, and I think real wisdom consists in knowing the wisdom, knowing that where to stop, where your power can extend and what power can achieve. And this is true of the world's greatest power. I don't think you can actually tell other countries how to run their business. You can make it attractive for them to do the right thing. You can impose costs. But again, you cannot do this according to the news cycle. This 6-hour, 12-hour, 24-hour news cycle, and keep measuring, am I winning, am I losing, am I winning, am I losing? No, I think you have to take it over a much longer term. If the Moldavians get a free port, get something that they think is useful for them out of China, they will get it. Either you offer them a better alternative, or you make sure that the terms in which they get it, and they have an interest in their own sovereignty as well. They're not interested in losing control over their own future and their own lives. You make sure that they are enabled to do that. Now, this you can't measure from moment to moment. And I don't think that's really the way to go. Besides, I think we also need to think in terms, in the longer term, of what does it actually mean to make investments in things which make no money. I mean, I've said this over and over again. Look at Hambantota as a port. 60,000 ships go past that port and nobody stops in it. So it can't make money. It can't pay back the $1.2 billion that was spent on it. So what happens? The Sri Lankans offer this to China, saying convert the debt into equity. Why don't you own it? The Chinese are clever. They know that owning a dud is no better than being owed money by a dud. So they say, give us a lease and we'll try and make it economically by building a special economic zone alongside it and so on. That's a long-term process. Now the problem here is, from everybody's point of view, I don't see it being in China's interest to have a 99-year lease on something that can't pay you money. So you have to make it start paying. Even if you started using it for the Navy and said it's security and therefore don't question this, it's still a cost. How many duds are you going to support around the world? So there is a trade-off here where, frankly, from my point of view, there's no point saying, oh, this is a huge loss for India, this is a huge gain. I think it's a much more complicated situation. And each of these things has to be looked at in a longer time frame and in terms of its real effect on your security. If there were a Chinese military base there, yes, it would be a serious concern for India. Today, it's potentially something that could, because you can't see a possible economic use of it, it's something that should worry you. And see whether you can ring-fence the problem, whether there are ways of dealing with it. But it's not a win or lose situation, it's not a black or white calculation. From anyone's point of view, not the Chinese, not India, not Sri Lanka, or anybody else who's interested in security.
Thanks. I might go to Pastor Lavin. I'm not trying to get back to you because you talked about the difficulty of dealing with India as a trade partner, that you had a first-hand experience as a trade negotiator. But I might just ask you about what's going on in the US. The US is just historically championed open trade. Today, I think it's entering into a fight with the Chinese, also with allies. Essentially, the traditional question, I think what you heard in Washington, we've done the liberal international order, but we must protect. To one, where Trump is asking, what has the liberal order done for us lately? Not much, therefore, I'm going to challenge the core foundations of it. That's one problem. The second thing, you saw what Trump said 2 days ago. when asked about why would give money to North Korea to do the denuclearization, he said, yeah, we discussed it, really, I mean, South Korea should do more, Japan, China maybe. These are neighbors of North Korea, they should be doing more. We are far away. I mean, I'm not his exact quotes, but something to that he's saying basically, you guys take care of your problems. Now, I don't think US is yet there, but if the US moves in that direction, that the Asians must solve their own problems, and Asians who historically said Asia for Asians, today might suddenly find the Americans even soften their kind of control. Actually, the problems of dealing with American retrenchment are going to be far more consequential than today dealing with American power. So where did these countries go?
Yeah, I was reflecting my anecdote from Mikhail Gorbachev a few minutes ago could probably equally apply to the United States, couldn't it? To say, you know, the economy is performing extremely well. I mean, standard of living is very high, growth is very high, investments up. But by the way, trade is up. Exports are up, imports are up, investments are up. So if you just looked at those indicators, you'd say the system's working very well. But at this moment, the paradox is that there's always been this undercurrent in American politics that has been more nationalist or even isolationist, or call it minimalist, skeptical of America's international role, viewed international engagement with even hostility, that the U.S. is the worst for it. We're not the better for it, we're the worst for it. But that view had typically been a minority view, and it's certainly never been a leadership view. So it's unusual to find in American politics that the leadership itself says we are skeptical about international activity. By the way, so part of what we're seeing though is the man. Part of what we're seeing is the moment, and I'll spend a little time on that because it's easy to fixate on. President Trump is so highly stylized in how his public comments and how he approaches issues. It's easy to sort of fixate on that, try to diagnose it, which that's what we're doing. But the moment is what's interesting because I think we saw, beginning I would say with the Obama administration, the transition from the post-Cold War view of foreign policy to a post-Cold War, meaning Obama came into office saying we need to question America's international role. And is the cost of this greater than the benefit? And why are we locked in permanently to a Cold War architecture where the U.S. must shoulder the cost? And for Obama, it was Bush and Iraq. It was you fellows overshot. It cost you too much. You caused political problems. You caused bloodshed. I mean, this is just a hatch. So I'm going to not just try to rationalize the role in Iraq, but I'm going to try to withdraw or minimize international commitments. So we had a significant drawdown in U.S. commitments in NATO. We had, I think, reduction in U.S. force presence across the board, reduction in U.S. defense budget for the 8 years. But I think you say the saving grace of this is that Obama exuded an enormous amount of personal charm and grace. And he, at least on a personal level, didn't radiate any negative views toward international colleagues. So Trump, at least, is not radically different in some respects. Obama's the first president in the modern era to come into office saying we're going to end trade treaties. So he said in the course of the campaign we're going to pull out of NAFTA. He said something a little more delicate. We're going to look at pulling out of NAFTA. He said he stopped three trade agreements with Colombia, Peru, and Korea. Although 2 years into his administration, he went ahead a little afraid. So Obama sort of was a version of Trump in some respects, although stylistically they're very, very different individuals. So you'd say both of these gentlemen come into office, I would say, without a strategic sense of, or a strategic premise that America has a leadership role to play in the world. And America should do this not out of altruism or because some foreigners tricked us, but because it's in our own interest. Even in a post-Cold War era where there might not be a strategic challenge to the United States, it's in the interest of the United States to engage as much as possible with other nations and try to shape outcomes so there is some kind of international structure from which all countries can benefit. So we're going to be the guarantor of international stability. I think Obama would say, don't do that. It's way too expensive and you're going to get it wrong, right? So there's nothing wrong with pulling back. And Trump, I think, would also say, don't do that. Don't do that. These fellows are going to cheat you. He brims with almost hostility or sense of grievance He sort of says, they've been cheating us and lying to us and, no more, we're not gonna have it that way. But, so sorry, it's a long answer to your question, but I think what this tells you is his mindset is not particularly a policy mindset, but what does the United States get out of this particular approach? His mindset is much more of a transactional mindset. So there's not necessarily a history here, there's not a past, there's not a future, there's simply what are you doing to me today? And he has these odd metrics like the trade deficit. And he says, well, if you have a trade deficit, you're cheating me. You are cheating me if I have a trade deficit, you're cheating me.
You're sixth on this.
But you say you can't even, for some most economists, me included, would say this is not a useful metric for evaluating whether someone is cheating or not, even though if you go into a shop and you buy something, you have a trade deficit with that shop, that's not the fellow didn't cheat you. You willingly purchased something and you have a product, he has the money, but that's called merchandise. So, but that's Trump's mindset in this phenomenon. So I think we're in that kind of a world. That's how he backs into the Korea set of challenges where he's sort of intrigued with this, and then he also pulls out. He doesn't find trade or trade agreements intrinsically appealing.
Thanks. Rahul, you didn't, you spoke mostly about India, but I wanted to ask you something about Europe, since you live in London, at the ISAS. Is there Europe kind of withdrew from east of Suez, British policy, but generally out of decolonization, most Europeans really withdrew from Asia, and the Americans really became the dominant force. That was the American retrenchment mechanism for reducing their burdens in this part of the world. Europe is also talking about strategic autonomy. Some of them talk about doing more in Asia, some more in Indian Ocean. So you hear anything in London, about Europe's long-term role? That if you look at the European global strategy, the document that came out a year and a half ago, there is talk about Europe doing more in this part of the world. And maybe means hearing a French defense minister, the British defense minister, speaking at Shangri-La dialogue saying, we want to do more, we want to do things together. So is there a new East of Suez policy in
Thank you, Raj. I mean, before I go into that, I think it's more exciting to respond to Ambassador Menon. I in some manner, I respectfully disagree with Ambassador Menon. I mean, let's take 2 or 3 issues together. One is the factual part. Now, at the Shangri-La dialogue, I was chairing a session which is on the record on Indian Ocean cooperation and competition, and the Sri Lankan Defense Secretary was one of the speakers. He spoke about Amandota, and then there was a lot of queries and questions there. And the point that Ambassador Menon brought up did come up, and that is that there are no ships. There are no ships in the port, and there are no aircraft at the airport next to Amandota. And his response was on the contrary, that actually that's factually not correct. There are ships that have started coming in, that the numbers will increase, but it's already increased in the last few months, and that the airport is again, it's started and will come up. So I think we've got to see this in context, and the context is that very often we may like to believe that there are no ships or no aircraft, but it may not be fully correct. I wasn't looking at it, I think, in terms of black and white environment and that India is losing here or winning there. I think it is more complex, and I agree with Ambassador Menon, it is more complex. But I think what is important is that we should not be in a denial mode on this. That there are developments that have taken place. The Maldives is one example. In London a few weeks ago, I hosted a former Vice President of the Maldives to speak. Part of it was on the record, part of it was off the record. And there are grave concerns that he portrayed in terms of China's increasing investment, role and influence in the Maldives, including some islets of the Maldives. Now, we can ignore it and say, well, that doesn't matter, that's what China does. That's fine, that's the government's policy to do that. But I think we should just be a little more pragmatic and feel that there are developments that are taking place. We have the same situation possibly in Seychelles. The second of the 4 speakers in my session on cooperation, competition in Indian Ocean was a Seychelles minister. And one of the questions that was asked to her was, what is the latest status of the India-Seychelles agreement that was leaked publicly, embarrassingly to India? And her response was, well, it is the Parliament's will on this, and it was not, it was too early for such an agreement, and the Parliament will have to decide on what happens in the next stages. A very clear sign that these things are not going to move forward. If we go beyond the Indian Ocean, Nepal is a classic example of where things can go right sometimes and things can go wrong, and pretty wrong, badly wrong others. So my point is that, we need to step back a bit. We need to look at it holistically and say, well, what is India doing in the Indian Ocean? If it does want to be operationally active in the Indian Ocean, if it does see the Indian Ocean as key to its future, it has to take a leadership role in the Indian Ocean. Now, one important aspect of the leadership role is a question that I asked both the Seychelles minister and the Sri Lankan Defence Secretary, which was that as small island states in the Indian Ocean, what do you want the region to do for you? And both said, no one has asked us this question. Most of the time, the region tells us what they want us to do for them, but no one asks us what we would like the region to do for us. And there were three or four things that they put across. So my first point, I think, is that that there are developments taking place. We should understand these developments, and we should really ask the question of what the small states of the Indian Ocean need and require, and how to build on it. One of them is trust, one of them is development, etc. The final point on this, I think, is that there are important regional organizations. I think IORA, which we discussed, is one of them. I've looked very deeply into India's role in IORA over the last 2 or 3 years. But there is, I think India is not automatically comfortable in such a multilateral organization, preferring, of course, bilateral relationships right through. So there are things that can be done. IORA is one area to do it in. Maritime security has come on the IORA platform, and this needs to be developed with support from other countries, particularly in areas of maritime domain awareness. So I'm more excited to answer responding in this way, but also in the question you asked, Raj, about Europe. I think post-Brexit Europe is going to be very different, particularly for the UK. And we need to see what sort of relationship is established between the UK and the EU on this. In terms of the UK first, the UK is interested in a post-Brexit environment where it sees itself and wants others to see itself as a global Britain. So the expansion of British trade relationships worldwide beyond Europe is very important, which is why suddenly the Commonwealth heads of government meeting in London a few weeks ago became very important to the UK, because this was actually accidentally based in the UK this year. But it became very important because in a post-Brexit agenda, the Commonwealth was part of the global Britain agenda. So there is a clear interest in going global on trade issues. France is the last country I want to touch on. France has strong Indian Ocean interests. It has assets, it has people, it has, as the French defense minister said at the Shanghai Dialogue, it has an exclusive economic zone, also a large EEZ in the Indian Ocean. And we are seeing, I think, greater cooperation between France and India, but also France's role in the Indian Ocean. So I think there are, out of the EU countries, France particularly, and possibly the UK would be the two countries to watch.
I think we have worked there. I think the last question to you, I see you talked about confidence building measures, free zones. I'm somewhat skeptical that, it's often said about CBMs that they're most useful when they're not needed, and they're least useful actually when you need them. And that essentially, is it really multilateral institutions, as Menon said, is a reflection of power politics? And if power politics are breaking down to a new order, can multilateralism really address problems that the balance of power cannot? So, if Singapore great experience for the last many years in building ASEAN-related architecture, done other institutions like RECAP, etc. But at this juncture, I think when the pressure is mounting on ASEAN, the pressure is mounting on the old institutions, can multilateralism really be the solution to deal with the new challenges at sea? There's some issues, of course, on environmental issues, or better management of maritime traffic. But I'm not looking at those, but in the more structural security governance, really smart trackers are really great.
Okay, thank you for your queries. Now, if you drag me back to the high security issues that I tried to avoid. But I suppose, this is the reality in the Indian Ocean region. Now, for a great power to act legitimately, and I don't mean just in terms of rules, but acceptability by weaker states, medium powers, and so on, you need to act in a multilateral setting. Why multilateralism? Again, this is IR Theory 101. Multilateralism constrains, at least makes it constraining in a benign way of great powers. So if you act within a multilateral setting, your leadership is more likely to succeed. So you look at China, again, I'm not excusing all China's excesses in implementing the BRI. If it has an AIIB to complement the BRI, it makes it look a little bit more acceptable. And of course, China is a partner to ASEAN within China-ASEAN Special Dialogue. And then there's the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So if China says, I'm going to help Kazakhstan, Iran do this and that, but we also happen to be, talking about the spirit of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, it reduces the weaker states' fears of Chinese penetration, domination, and so on. And I like to again talk the idea of non-traditional security issues. Now this is where I think sometimes big powers feel that they need to be, but they can't justify to the parliaments or congresses why they should spend money, to clean up the oceans. Because this is the least vote-winning measure. So this is where you palm it off to a multilateral sector. We need a collective action solution. So this is where we go to IORA. You see, IORA, this is a common problem in our neighborhood. The ocean is dirty. Can't you get clean up underway? I will lead, but so should everyone else. This is, I think, the beauty of multilateralism.
Thank you. I think we will now go to the floor. We've got about 25 minutes of question and answers. So please ask a question short and clear. Identify yourself. If there's any particular person you want to ask a question on the panel.
You do this.
Rani, Dr. Rani.
Thank you. Thank you very much for a really interesting panel there. I guess maybe I'd like to be sort of push you a little bit here. The way I think there was some optimism there that perhaps I don't share as much, and so the question of or the lack of political willpower that we're seeing. When you look at the U.S. The U.S. talks about, has rebranded to the Indo-Pacific, huge issues in terms of what that actually means. And of course, difference in what Indo-Pacific means between the US and India. So when it comes down to it right now, especially given who we have in the White House, lack of willingness to put muscle behind that. India is talking about free and fair trade, open sea lanes of communication, but is really unwilling to step up to it. Did not mention the Quad this weekend. Elections are coming up next year. The reality is Modi's going to be loath to do anything about it. And then, of course, here in Singapore, there is this issue of the defense minister saying we don't want to take sides. ASEAN is consensus-based, and so there's always a veto power. That's going to be Cambodia. Given all of this, what do you do in terms of actually getting back to the issue of governance, building up any kind of institutional architecture where each of the major and even the minor powers are willing to actually do something? Thanks.
Thanks. We'll take two more questions, then come back to the answer.
Dr. Javana's book triggered my enthusiasm to delving into these very important topics of security and trade. But I'm not going to talk about security. As an old sea dog, it's enough. But I think in trade, think the emphasis should be on trade, in the sense that only Dr. or Ambassador Lavin, you wrote something about trade in India. I think it's important. I don't know what the views of the panel is like, in the sense that we see very little trade, generally speaking, within India and ASEAN. Okay? But however, I must qualify that I know of two corporations, private sector, Singapore and Malaysia, jointly doing very well in India. Okay? You're talking in terms of it's a big organized investment, or shall we say. Now the thing is this, again, we mustn't forget the role of China, in the sense that China is a big investor too. Of course, there are intricacies about that. Huh? But I think this can be overcome, because you see, when I look at this Indo-Pacific, you got to look into the sensitivity of some people. In the sense that China is the Indo, it's Indian Pacific. Yeah, so South China Sea is mine. So I think maybe we should look back and see whether, in the old days we used to call it Far East and Middle East, and Asia Pacific. Now when you talk about Asia Pacific, it includes everyone. You don't leave out, what do you call it, the important players. Right, so the question is that, what do you call that, in trade, I think trade is very important. I think it's important that this must be emphasized. What does the panel say about it?
Thank you. Professor.
Thank you, Chair.
The wrong end.
Oh, sorry. Thank you, Chair. This is if Professor Alan Chong wanted to avoid high security. I'm afraid I cannot oblige you, because this has to do with high security. You spoke of Indian Ocean as a zone of peace, an earlier concept. In terms of nuclear-free zones, of course, we've seen Tlatelolco, which is fairly successful in the Caribbean and Latin America. And in the South Pacific, we've seen Rarotonga. Are you suggesting that there ought to be, now that you have, as you said, 3 nuclear powers in the region, is there a need or use of an understanding as in Rarotonga or Tlatelolco in the Indo-Pacific region? And secondly, this is this is conventional. The procurement of submarines. Countries around the region are now rapidly procuring several classes of submarines: the Min submarine, the Wan submarine, which is even more advanced. And these Min submarines, these are fairly inexpensive. They come at 100 million. This thing. So, are you thinking of what kind of CBMs would you recommend for conventional procurements of weapons such as submarines in the region?
I think we have 3 very good questions, one on the political will and implementation of the rhetoric, one on trade, one on arms race and regulation of the new arms race that came in last minute. Should we start with you, Mr.
Well, I'm not sure whether you mean nuclear-free zone or you mean a zone like
Now nuclear-free zone, now that there are 3 nuclear powers.
Well,
and secondly is conventional.
Well, I think there used to be a proposal for a South Asia nuclear-free zone which went nowhere very rapidly. And the fact is there's more than 3 nuclear weapon states here. And the US is also in the region. And nobody knows whether Russian, French submarines, the Indian Ocean is a perfect place to base SSBNs. So I think we need to be a little careful when we start to find. It's all very well to say nuclear-free zones. These amount to the CBMs that Raja was talking about, which are very good in peacetime, but when you really need them, I'm not sure that you can stop missiles flying through these zones, or nobody's really sure how they're really going to work in practice if things were to break down, which would be disastrous in any case. So it's not, for me, actually, the presence of India and Pakistan as nuclear weapon states has actually stabilized the situation in South Asia. But that's a whole different argument. I don't think that's something you want to get into. About the lack of political willpower. You are today at a situation where, yes, there is very little political willpower to do the kinds of things that we've been talking about before, certainly on the security side in the region. But I think everybody realizes that the level of uncertainty and instability has gone up, which is why we see this arms race and so on. And there will come a point where they will have to make a choice, where they're not going to believe that the future is necessarily going to be better for them. When they see the results of this arms race, and they see that this is actually imperiling the prosperity which it is supposed to protect. And I think we're getting near the point. Quite frankly, I think we're somewhere near that stage. One reason why I think you've had so many ideas of security architecture, of an Asia-Pacific community, of enabling East Asia Summit to do much more on the security side, and even what you have from China, ideas of what a CO should be doing on the security side, and so on. I think these are the first signs. We're not there yet, but I would like to think that we're rational and sensible enough that we will figure it out.
Answer the question,
I'll just offer a comment. I probably have less of a security background than everybody on this stage, but I can relate that we are going to see U.S. defense build up, and we'll see a disproportionate engagement from the U.S. in South Asia. And the change of name of the Pacific Command, the Pacific Command, is an indicator of that. But I think just the arithmetic of this tells me it's inward, meaning there's no need or argument or requirement for increased NATO exercises or exchanges or training. I mean, that's a fully mature relationship. So the place that, to use the language of before, the place that's a bit underweight is U.S. South Asian engagement, and there's money on the table. So that gap's going to be closed. Trade, look, I love what your message is. I think there's a significant trade opportunity for all the South Asian nations, and I'll elaborate on an earlier point. The more I spend time in trade, the more I see trade as not just as a cause of economic growth, but also as maybe even more important, as a coincident indicator of growth, meaning countries that are trade rationalists tend to be economic rationalists. So it's an indicator of the fact that the whole country is moving toward better budget management, better rational tax system, et cetera, et cetera. They've finally got the arms around the demon of trade, and they're moving toward rationalism in that direction as well. So it's useful in its own right, and it's also a coincident indicator that the senior economic management is serious about the whole country moving ahead.
You want to comment on the serious arms race regulation?
All right, then we'll quickly dispatch the first...
A little louder, please.
I was. Let me dispatch the first question about lack of political will. Now, this is, of course, an answer from basic IR theory. If you have momentum from pre-existing baby steps, if you call it that, in multilateralism, you realize that you will create some initial momentum. And people who are engaged in that version 1.0 of multilateralism will develop stakes in it, emotional, psychological, political, and so on. So it cannot die, all right? And little by little, familiarity permeates across these transnational interactions. There will be a bureaucratic elite across a number of states that will want this process to carry on. And that's how US-Soviet Dayton started. One must not forget, Dayton was not abstract at the level of senior State Department officials, and Ambassador Lavin can of course verify this, or at the level of residents. It started out with meetings of nuclear scientists, physicists, and so on. So little by little, again, I'm also addressing the third gentleman's question, you build up this political capital amongst the players involved. And then at some point, over time, you have some kind of nuclear peace lobby. All right, made out of people who are initially hostile, suspicious of one another, because they keep meeting regularly. And those of us who do monitor so-called track to multilateralism in the Asia Pacific, and the Asia Pacific rim, of course, is equally bewildering in terms of the combinations. You realize that when you meet regularly in forums like CSCAP, CSCAP, Conference on Security Cooperation in Asia Pacific, you have a proliferation of working groups on all kinds of security issues, including submarine search and rescue. And because of that, I don't foresee a major war breaking out across the Asia Pacific. And you notice that China dares not say, I'm going to fortify these islands because I'm going to fight you tomorrow. Would they dare say that? No. You look at the Chinese rhetoric very carefully, word for word. They say that we are there to ensure safety and accessibility. Should a plane or ship go down in the South China Sea, our military facilities are there to assist. Would they dare say, I'm here to position a bomber so that I can bomb Manila within 24 hours? No one will say that. All right? So the fact is, the language will bind China over time. If you have warlike intentions, all right, people will hold you to your word. Would the Chinese scandalize themselves in that regard? I'm not so sure. All right? So this is again me, the supporter of neoliberal institutionalism. And about the nuclear issue, again, my mirror lesson is from the Cold War. Now, the reason why the Soviets and Americans managed to sign strategic arms limitation talks is because of initial contact. Again, if you are a closed society, you might say that this is contamination. But in this day and age, I don't think you can even say that, in closed societies, there's no contamination. Right? Nuclear physicists would meet at professional conferences. They will talk about things. And nuclear safety, I think, is a matter of universal concern. Whether you're in China, the United States, or even India, what happens if there is a nuclear leak? All right, I think all right-thinking nuclear safety officials will want to meet at these forums. And I think this is an incremental way to build up support for a nuclear-free zone. I don't know if it will materialize within our lifetimes, but certainly you start talking about it, it might just happen. And I noticed between North and South Korea, they re-established a hotline. That, I think, is a huge positive step forward in the direction of a nuclear-free Korean peninsula. Now, the point about submarine CBMs, I can only speak from what I know of what my colleagues in RSIS and other think tanks in Singapore are doing. I do know for a fact that under the ASEAN Defense Ministers meeting plus, they've started talking about search and rescue or submarine disasters. That's one way of getting navies that have got submarine fleet aspirations to start talking. Whether you actually have a fleet that can pose an offensive potential to your rival is beside the point. The point is when a submarine sinks, every navy faces this nightmare. So we need to learn from one another. And in this way, perhaps we might learn also that we may not want a submarine fleet. Because what happens if our sailors go down with the vessel? Can we rescue them? And I think the Russians learned the hard way. I guess a few years ago, I think it was 5-6 years ago, when one of their major nuclear submarines sank, and then NATO vessels were in the vicinity to offer help, and they said, no, our pride is more important. I think that's not the way to go. And that's, I think, the Russian Navy for you. I hope in the Indo-Pacific we can learn a lot more, learn faster than the Russians.
Rahul, you have something.
Sure. Very briefly, I think for nuclear weapon-free zones, I think it's very difficult to even start some of these, sort of any discussion of this. I also don't think that it is pragmatic in a way to do so. I think there's also a problem if you look at zone of peace issues. I mean, we all know what happened to the zone of peace for the Indian Ocean and the attempts there. But again, the way that a new zone of peace initiative is designed, I think is very important. But again, there are concerns there. The reason I say these two things is because the bottom line is that there's a lack of trust within the Indian Ocean community, within the littoral and island states of the Indian Ocean. And this is where I want to bring in Rani's point of political will. I think political will is important to initiate. There is a lack of it at the moment. And I would see that the area to do so, especially for India. I mean, India does seek to be a leading power in the Indian Ocean, is to look at the Indian Ocean Rim Association, is to look at the Indian Ocean Naval Symposium, two sort of regional bodies, and to see how these can be further made more effective and empowered. I think we have some existing structures. Let's build confidence and trust within the organization and try to move forward on it.
Thanks, Rahul. I think we'll take one more round of questions and then we can bring it to close after that. All the panelists have the last one. Yes, sir.
If you look at the Indian Ocean, now there are new countries that access it, particularly the Chinese and the Russians as well through Gwadar port. So do you think there's a possibility of some kind of power sharing within the Indian Ocean, or is this going to be another superpower playground? Because the Indians have ambitions in the Indian Ocean, and China has the ability to invest in the particular Indian Ocean countries. So do you think this will be a superpower playground? My next question is specifically for the American ambassador. It's regarding relations with Iran. Okay, you see is that if the United States has a war in Afghanistan, and if the US NATO supply routes are closed in Pakistan, you will need the help of the Indians to actually use Chabahar port to access Afghanistan. So do you think? The thing is that from time to time, the policy of the Americans change. Every 2 years you have midterm elections, 4 years there's a presidential elections, and 8 years you get a new president. So the thing is that do you think India can be of help can help the Americans to actually deal with the Iranians? Thanks.
Thank you. Anybody else? Rani? Sorry.
Thank you very much to all the panelists. I'd like to press Ambassador Menon because you are, I think, a realist. And Professor...
It's not a crime.
No. Because this is what is so fascinating about Indian foreign policy. There's always this reaction of not wanting to come across as behaving as a realist power. So coming to Professor Mohan's point about balance of power, I think he was the only person to use that term in the panel. Is India playing the game of balance of power, or is India still shirking that game? And if it isn't playing that game, does India do foreign policy differently? Or is it aspiring to do foreign policy differently as a rising power? Thank you.
Does anyone else one last question? Yes, please.
Just on the recently concluded Shangri-La talk and also on the Indo-Pacific specific discussions around that, it's three aspects, which is strategic, economic, and to a certain extent environmental, if everybody agrees to it. However, we see that the economics, environments, everything is being overshadowed by the strategic aspect of it, because there's so much of uncertainties, or at least kind of confidence-building measures are not very much in place in most of the scenarios. So, is it that the smaller nations are salivating to the idea of economic benefits through this Indo-Pacific alliance itself, and in the garb of which they are playing unknowingly into the hands of the larger players who may be having a strategic advantage in the region?
Thank you. I think that again, good set of questions. So we'll close the last round. Any other thoughts to add also coming to that company? We'll go the other way.
Okay, I realize that I'm the defender of some kind of neoliberal order here. Now, if you look at the world through realist lenses, can I suggest to whoever is still, hardcore realist at the end of this discussion, to stop reading Thucydides or Machiavelli, read E.H. Carr, 20 Years Crisis, read the book cover to cover. You realize that this is a realist with a conscience at the end of it. He's horrified by what he's written, and you realize that if you want to secure the future, you need to take a leap of faith in terms of multilateral institutions. You read that whole chunk of his book, where he talks about multilateralism. And you realize that this is a realist that has actually got the contrast is that it's just that he's afraid to admit it. So the point about looking at port development across the region, now you can read the nightmare scenarios, okay, this is the 19th century, Great Britain has a port, France must have a port within proximity, the Americans must also have one, the Germans must also have one, so that we check one another. This is the way China was sliced up. I hope people don't go on this route and look at it that way, because a port is an opportunity. Now, I take direction from Raja Mohan's opening remark, 1601. Why can't we learn from that world? When things were as free and open access as we hope it would be again. We should actually look at port development as a net win for the region. Instead of saying that, oh, just because China built this, it's going to be their base exclusively. Why can't it be a base for trade with everybody else? And so on. On that note, I leave it.
To the specific question about U.S.-India military cooperation, I think we're going to see a steady uptick in that activity. I think it would be a mistake to frame it with regard to a specific military mission, because then you're implicitly asking your partner in this exercise to endorse the mission. And so what you're really looking for is just, can we improve interoperability? Can we improve training? Can we collaborate on peacetime activity like search and rescue, coordination, incidents at sea activity? We're starting at a low base, let's just get the tempo of activity up. I wouldn't start by saying we're looking at military contingencies and we want active support from the Indian military in the event of a war. I'd say that's the wrong way to start a relationship. You're attaching a huge price tag and there's no immediate need or requirement for it. So start with the easier peacetime activity. I thought Javanta, if I may say, asked a really intriguing question. I'm not an expert in Indian foreign policy, but I can say this. I spent a lot of time on trade statistics. Every country has the same export, and that is sanctimony. Every country has the need to assert moral superiority. Sometimes it's valid, sometimes it's not. And you'd say it's almost inversely correlated to your responsibility. If you're weak and irrelevant, then you have to say, I stand for what is right. Not only that, but I will go to an international conference, the purpose of which is to stand for what is right? So you see, it permeates foreign policy decision-making and discussions, right? So the symbolism even overrides what you can actually do. So you might say, look, is India, look, I have friends from India who would literally say things to me that you can tell we are a great nation because we have a government-owned airline. Yeah, I know, this is preposterous. Now, it's not a majority view now in India, but only a few decades ago, it's a majority view. This is obligatory for a great nation, a great culture to have a state-owned airline. I mean, it proves that we are a great nation that we have it. So, I mean, so you might say, look, is there too much realism? I would say it's more a regression to the mean. It's more of a move away from, foreign policy only as a symbolic exercise, the Bandar Declaration, and these were just purely symbolic exercises that didn't help anybody in India or around the world. So just abandoning that to say, actually, we are a consequential nation. What we do internationally matters. So why don't we think about purposeful steps we take to advance our national interest, which is not simply advantaging ourselves, but also a sense of stakeholder and a sense of system support. Right? So I would view that as sort of a welcome evolution.
Sure. There was a question on superpower playground in the Indian Ocean. And I just want to sort of look at the Indian Ocean in terms of, say, the India-China evolving relationship. And I think, we already have elements of competition there. So it's not that it is coming or it is shortly to arrive. I think it has arrived. The concern that I have is that there's nothing to mitigate against it, and that's the concern. Now, about 3 years ago, I think Ambassador Menon would know more accurately, there was a sort of CBM of sorts, which is India-China Maritime Cooperation sort of talks that was started between both countries to see whether there could be discussion on these issues. As far as I'm aware, that group met once and hasn't met again. So I think there needs to be more discussion. I think China is in the Indian Ocean. It has interests, its energy dependence, etc., etc. We need to ensure that if a Chinese ship has an accident or there is some concern in parts of the Indian Ocean, that both India and China and other countries can cooperate in search and rescue issues, etc. So I think there need to be developments that need to take place to mitigate some of the issues that we are seeing on the ground.
But I actually agree with Rahul that as far as India, China and the Indian Ocean is concerned, there are large elements of cooperation as well, and there will be elements of competition, and you need to actually talk this through to be much clearer, because the situation is changing so quickly. China is now in the Indian Ocean in ways that she wasn't before. My problem is, I'm an old man now. I remember people in '67 when Sri Lanka signed the Rice Rubber Pact with China. Oh, we've lost Sri Lanka, look at this, isn't this terrible? China's come and now there's going to be revolution throughout South Asia. And this is the trouble. When you get old, you say, oh, I've seen it all before. Now, the fact is it's very different today, the situation. And what's going on now is not just a balance of power or a military or a naval strategic game. There's economics, there's a whole level of interaction today which is much more complex. So I think we're now dealing with a multi-layered game and a multiplayer game, which is so much more complex. So can we be realists in this situation? Yes, in terms of the old English school, where it all started, and with the edge guard. Yes, I think we are realists, but how realist can you be? Do you set your goals realistically? Do you cut your coat according to your cloth? Do you say, I will transform India only to the extent that I can? Or do you say, I have foreign policy goals which help me to transform India, and those I set normatively as a society. So it's not that you don't have any norms. Secondly, if I were purely realist, there isn't another country in the world which has the same interests, the same attributes, the same situation as I'm in. Then why? But I can't do what I want without other people. I have to cooperate with others. So there is a level here where, I think we reduce realism to a caricature of itself in the way we talk about it. Yes, we're realists. We're realists in our assessment of what goes around us. We were among the first to realize there was a sinusoidal split. I don't think we've called the big things wrong. In fact, I think we've called many of them right. And in fact, today the rest of the world is now non-aligned actually, if you look at it, including the US. But that's another argument. But what I'm trying to say is that, yes, I think we're realistic in our assessments. We might present it in moral, didactic, sanctimonious terms, like everybody else does. We tell everybody we never admit we were wrong, but of course we're wrong sometimes. You can't be right all the time about what you see around you. We've made mistakes too, but show me a government that admits that it's ever been wrong, or that it's actually learned from experience. But I think this big thing is we've learned, and we've changed, at least in external security. If you look at what we are today in terms of structures, how we take decisions, what we do, we're very different from where we were 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And as long as you have the capacity to learn, I think you're all right. That, I think, gives me hope. More hope than just a realistic description of, these are my capabilities, this is the situation, this is what I can do, there are things I can't do, and therefore give up and go back to sleep.
Thanks. I think that's a good note to conclude this excellent session. The idea that realism is not a bad word, it's actually about moderation, setting modest goals, recognizing the constraints that because you're acting in a world of other sovereigns, that you're constantly constrained by the power and the capacity of others. And that in the end, everyone has domestic politics. That it is not, the world is not just a foreign policy. That each country, like we see today, domestic politics in the US is a huge variable. Domestic politics in China was a huge variable in the 60s and the 70s. So I think it is about recognizing the elements that no single sovereign can control, acknowledging that, And that within that space, how do we work out reasonable arrangements that would include measures to reduce arms race, improve everyone's security, reduce security dilemmas, and generate an element of cooperation. So I think that is going to be the big challenge for us at this point. I think looking ahead in the maritime spaces for South Asia, for East Asia, for Southeast Asia. So I think it's going to be an exciting agenda. So now there's just one more little thing to be done, which is going to be presentation of tokens of appreciation to all the panelists. But before we do that, I just wanted to offer 3 thanks and 1 promise. The first being, I think, to Rajaratnam, really grateful for you to be here with us today. Second, to all the audience, and I think to stay through, I think you've been a wonderful audience here. I think it's been a real pleasure to have all of you this afternoon and stay to the bitter end, as most of you have. So we really keep welcoming you to the ISAS events that go on. Finally, to Jivanta, that book, I think the book has been, you saw the kind of discussion it has provoked. Everyone wanted to provoke one way or another, and they have. So I would say this is going to be a theme, I think, that we will have to take it forward. And so congratulations on a timely book. On the promise, I mean, I think if we recognize that maritime issues are very important, and that's where much of the geopolitics, economics, environmental issues are going to come together. I think for the ISAS, this could be the beginning of a process where we work with others in the region, in Singapore, RSIs, and many of them are here today, which is a massive maritime program, and you're there, that you have the School of Law here in the US, one of the top legal schools. You have a large set of people working on technical and science-related issues in Singapore. So I think we have a huge community that is interested in the ocean issues. So hopefully we can work together to be able to work on the kind of challenges that come before us. Finally, I mean, I think we're going to celebrate the 200th anniversary of Singapore soon. Rafael's founding of this city. The original conception of the city itself was an open city, the idea that existed in Europe before. Open frontiers, a place of exchange, a place where different groups can come together and work. That's the spirit with which Singapore has worked. That's the spirit with which ASEAN was built as a platform for engagement, exchange and security building. But today I think that spirit is again needed. That's where hopefully we can contribute to the some in creative ways where we can be bullheaded, terribly realist. But I think in some terms of constructing some new ideas of how the region can come together to cope with a very demanding, very challenging situation in the maritime domain at this time. So let me stop here and thank you all once again. We're going to have this.
Professor and our panelists, I'd like to thank them for the engaging session. And now I'd like to invite Professor Mohan to present a token of appreciation to our guest speakers, Ambassador Frank Lavin, Mr. Rahul Roy-Chaudhury, and Associate Professor Alan Chong.
Thank you.
So thank you, Director.